So fun to see all the numbers just jump up as soon as that webinar time starts. Thanks everyone for logging on so promptly. We'll give it a minute or two to let everybody get comfortable and logged in, and then we're going to jump in. Okay. I think we will get started. So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We are here today for a great conversation about tutoring, but within a different framework than you might have heard before. So I'm thinking of it as a tutoring webinar remix. AdvocacyLabs is a joint initiative of FutureEd, where I'm the policy director at FutureEd, and 50CAN. We have Marc Porter Magee here as the CEO and founder of 50CAN. So FutureEd and 50CAN have been working together. Marc, I was looking back, and I think the first report came out 5 years ago in 2019.
That sounds right. Yeah, okay, something like that.
That's legit. Yeah. So we've spent the past 5 years thinking and exploring how change occurs, right? Like at FutureEd, we spend a lot of time thinking about what schools can or should do, what governments can or should do around education, right? And so, but with AdvocacyLabs, we're really trying to think about how that change occurs. And of course, 50CAN is engaged in advocacy out in the field across the country all the time. And next month, in July, AdvocacyLabs will publish our final report summarizing the 31 key findings that we've learned from studying the science of advocacy. Of course, when I say we, I don't mean me, I really just mean Marc. Marc is the brains and the workhorse behind this report, and he's going to be sharing some of those findings with us in just a minute or two. But when we thought about what we wanted to do as sort of a capstone of this 5 years of work, that I promise it's actually just, it's really cool stuff. And Marc, I love the way you always like come up with these great ways to distill the findings to make it really approachable. So we wanted to apply all these findings to something real that a lot of us are thinking and talking and working about right now, and we landed on tutoring. And so why did we pick tutoring? We picked it for 3 reasons. First, tutoring is considered the most effective academic intervention, or in more casual terms, it's just simply the best way to help kids who need a boost in learning or even just want to be learning more rapidly. It can work for all kinds of kids at all kinds of levels on all kinds of subjects. But second, we're seeing the results of high quality, high impact tutoring across the country right now. It's been the most common use of federal ESSER dollars to address learning loss. And what we know is that students benefit from the programs, teachers like it, school leaders have embraced it, parents appreciate it. Where tutoring works, it's changing school schedules, school culture, and even instructional practice. As many of you probably know, at FutureEd, we've been doing a lot of work on tutoring over the past 1.5 years, and I've had the privilege myself to visit tutoring programs in Texas, Louisiana, Ohio, New York, and Washington, D.C. And every time I have left whichever school I've been at, whatever kind of tutoring, and I've seen a lot of different kinds, right? I have always left feeling so optimistic about what the future of education could look like with tutoring as prominent tool in our toolbox. But the third reason that we chose tutoring to focus on for today is that all of this impact and progress and potential is actually at risk. Those federal ESSER dollars are quickly running out or will expire, and now is the moment to make the case for using ongoing federal, state, and local dollars to continue tutoring and expand it. So we have this awesome thing that works. We're seeing it work in lots of places, but we don't know what the future holds. Here comes AdvocacyLabs to the rescue. But this webinar, how is it going to work? So I'm going to briefly introduce our wonderful panelists, Paula, Chelsea, and Susanna. And then I'm going to turn it over to Marc to walk us through a brief overview of the big Advocacy Labs lessons. Then we'll bring the panelists into the conversation to talk about some of these lessons. And then importantly, audience members, we're also going to be asking and answering your questions. So please use the Q&A or the chat box, whatever functionality we have going, because I can never remember what we use at any given time. But please, no question is too small. We really want to hear them all. So briefly, who else is with me today? We have Paula White. Paula is the Executive Director of JerseyCAN in New Jersey. She's been an elementary school teacher. She founded and led a public charter school. She's served as the New Jersey Department of Education's Chief Turnaround Officer, among other positions. She is a relentless advocate for students and for high quality education. And she will be, of course, representing the perspective of folks on the ground in New Jersey trying to advocate for funding and support for high impact tutoring. We have Chelsea Crawford, who has recently stepped into the role of Executive Director of TennesseeCAN, but today is really coming sort of fresh off the boat of more than 4 years as Chief of Staff at the Tennessee Department of Education, where she's been intimately involved in Tennessee's statewide tutoring efforts, initiatives, and funding. Tennessee has been doing a lot and was really out in front in a lot of ways on the idea of using tutoring in this post-pandemic moment, as well as lots of other key policy and program areas to improve outcomes for kids. And we're so excited to have her here today. And Susanna Loeb, who is, of course, if you have been on any tutoring webinar in the last 2 years, Susanna has probably also been on it. She is the founder and executive director of the National Student Support Accelerator, which aims to expand access to high-impact tutoring to address inequities in educational opportunities. Susanna is also a professor at Stanford University, where NSSA is based, and has done lots of other cool stuff in her career, too. And then finally, Marc, the one who did all the work, Marc Porter Magee, CEO and founder of 50CAN. I was looking at your bio, Marc, so I think you're at almost 20 years of state level education advocacy work. Is that
sounds about right? Yeah, I joined CAN in 2005. Yeah.
So next year will be 20 years of what it means to do state level education advocacy work. He got that under his belt, along with what many of you may not know is a secret or not so secret PhD in sociology that explains why he thought reading thousands of pages of advocacy research sounded like fun. So, and he's had so much fun, and now we get to hear all the fun things that he learned because we didn't have to do the reading. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Marc to walk us through your findings, and then we'll bring Paula, Chelsea, and Susanna in a few minutes.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Liz. I was thinking back, Liz, to 3 years ago in 2021. I think it was fall 2021 when you called me and you're like, learning loss is huge. We're seeing the numbers are coming back. We've got a huge problem. Everyone's just pushing the same old thing. We have to put new ideas and new interventions on the table. I'm like, all right. And I'm like, what do you think we should do? You're like, tutoring. And you sort of like jumped in and wrote a policy brief and started beating the drum, and so many different campaigns inside 50CAN and out kind of picked up the message. And it's actually, while it's been a really challenging time in education, it's been incredibly heartening to see the progress we've made over the past 3 years. So I'm excited we're putting a spotlight on it. All right, so first thing I get to do, the other thing I'm excited about is I get to be the one to provide a preview of this guidebook. So let me share it with you. And I should say, we're super excited. We've got the PDF here, and I'm going to kind of just share a few of the pages, but we're printing up guidebooks. You can go to FutureEd and sign up for the newsletter there. You can go to 50can.org and sign up for our newsletter. And next month, when we have the guidebooks in hand, we're going to let people apply to get a free copy. So be sure to sign up for those, and we're excited to put them into your hands. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to explain the guidebook and a few lessons from it and kind of our approaches. As Liz said, we've sort of thought of this work as kind of like a treasure hunt. We get to go through thousands of articles and find the ones that are both like really well done, but also that are relevant to our work. So we get to put on both, both the research hat and the advocacy hat and figure out what's the intersection between those. So the way we organize this guidebook is we looked at the different strategies you can use to make change in the world, and then the evidence-based tactics that have come through in these 7 reports we've published. And we've brought them all together into hopefully enjoyable, accessible lessons that you can put to use right away. So I am definitely not going to read all 31 lessons today. I'm going to pick out a few, and I'm just going to kind of dip in and provide a teaser and sort of a jumping off point for our discussion. So let me jump in. So we start with social movements. So this is a strategy that I think is kind of quintessential advocacy, where you're bringing lots of people together, you're joining together around a common effort, and you're making your voices heard. And through that work, agenda setting on the policy front. So we're going to pull out 2 lessons from that. So the first is begin with betrayal, which is sometimes shocking when we sort of lead with that title, but it's meant to be kind of provocative, because oftentimes advocacy work can be a little bloodless when we're talking about policy, but most people engage with this work around emotions. And there's been a lot of research on the emotions that actually get people off the sidelines and into advocacy. And what studies have shown is that it's when people are getting really upset that leads them to step forward. And it's particularly powerful when people are feeling let down by their government. And that sense of betrayal, that the government that should be representing you isn't representing you, is particularly powerful. So one example from the political science world is the work around what made Rosa Parks' work in the Montgomery boycott so effective. And one of the things that they found is that it was this incredible sense of resentment, the sense of injustice, and particularly this idea that you were paying for a service that was treating you terribly, including violently enforcing segregation. And so Rosa Parks said in one of her interviews, we shouldn't be expected to not react to violence. It's a human reaction, and that's what we are, human beings. And it was that sense of outrage that led to the spark that grew that movement. And I think what we found is in other advocacy movements, when it's failing to get off the ground, it's usually because there isn't that emotion present. So researchers look at the issue of climate change, where it's proven really difficult to get everyone galvanized. And in part, it's because oftentimes people feel a sense of despair. And despair leads you to kind of sit back rather than jump in. So as we're thinking about our work, what are the emotions that actually get people off the sidelines? The second thing when you're building a social movement that I wanted to highlight is this idea of a bandwagon effect. So I think we've seen this in different aspects of our life. So one metaphor people use is the wave at a ballpark, where if people start standing up and it's coming around and a lot of people are joining in, by the time it gets to your part of the park, you're probably likely to jump up as well. But likewise, if it starts to die down, maybe that next time it comes around, you stay in your seat. So we are social creatures. We tend to look right and left, and we join in when other people are. And that is a big part of what social movements are about, is how do you get that wave going? So there's a professor, Tondra Loder-Jackson, who looked at this from an education perspective, including the children's marches during the civil rights movement. And what she found is that it was the role of teachers in making this idea of a children's march visible to their classrooms and giving children permission to step forward as leaders and join in that allowed that to reach critical mass, where nearly 90% of students in schools ended up participating in the march. So one of the things we need to think about when we're trying to create a bandwagon around our issues is, how do we make that visible? How do we make it easy to join in? Another strategy we look at is more of an inside strategy. We call this elite negotiations. And this is where you're trying to engage with people who already have power, political power, particularly elected officials, and figure out how do you work with them to help them be champions on your issue. So one idea that's come through in a lot of the research is actually that you are more likely to be successful when you have a bold goal than when you have a modest goal. And that may feel kind of counterintuitive. We often are tempted to negotiate with ourselves. What if we just ask for this little thing? Maybe that'll make it easier for people to say yes. But it turns out that people are really drawn to big goals. And you're going to take a lot of fire making change no matter what you're doing. So there's a strong incentive to pick your moments when, as an elected official, you're championing something that could be a legacy issue for you. So one example from the research is the work that the Clinton administration did on changing rules around cleaning up gasoline. So back in the 90s, one of the big issues environmentalists were arguing for was to get sulfur out of gasoline or reduce the amount. And they tried every year, year after year, to try to chip away at this. And finally, in the last year of the administration, rather than making a 10% change or a 20% change, they announced they were reducing sulfur by 90%. And when the interviewers talked to the people involved in the decisions, what they found is that they felt like they were going to get a hit from the oil companies, whether they went for a 10% cut or not. So rather than try to roll this out incrementally, they chose their moment and took that hit and got the big change. And there's a sociologist named William Gameson, and when he looked at this, he found across 50, 60 years of advocacy that it was the groups that chose those bolder goals that were more likely to get wins. And so it's something we think about when we do this advocacy is what would the bold version of our goal be? Why don't we start there? Another key lesson from this inside work is persistence. And this is a tough one because every year we fight really hard for our issues, and it can be tough to come up short. But the one thing that successful advocates have in common is they don't give up. So another example from the research is around criminal justice reform. So if you remember back to the 1990s, this was an issue that was struggling to get traction with Democrats or Republicans at the federal level. And a lot of advocates started at the federal level with a federal bill, and they were getting nowhere. And what they found is that a change in venue was very helpful. So they went to the state level, to Texas and Georgia, and started work there. And they got a breakthrough in 2013 in Georgia when they passed sweeping criminal justice reform. And they were able to show that that dramatically reduced the number of people going to jail, reduced costs without having an effect on the crime rate. And then they used that leverage to go back to the federal level, and in 2018 got a victory there as well. So oftentimes it's that change in venue that can be really helpful. And you have to often measure this work in decades instead of just years. And then I thought we'd finish by looking at emergent networks and expert communities as a strategy. And one of the things we don't often think about is our own brand when we're doing this work. But the brand is really important for bringing people into the work. And so an example from the research that really resonated was around the education group Equal Education in South Africa. And this was a group that emerged after the apartheid era. And they were realizing that a lot of the promises made by the government weren't coming through on education. But when they tried to start that advocacy, they got a lot of pushback. Who are you to challenge these group of anti-apartheid advocates now running the government? So what they had to do is really think about their brand that they were using to make the case. And so they decided to use the slogan, "Every generation has its struggle," and to use revolutionary icons such as, a raised fist grasping a ruler to connect to that kind of revolutionary push, using the colors of the South African flag, and to try to figure out concrete ways to symbolize what the problem was. So working with students, they realized that a lot of the schools they were advocating for had broken windows in the school. So they encouraged the students to take pictures of those windows. They put that together into an art exhibit and use that to get new public attention on the big promises that weren't being met in the schools. And that turned the whole conversation around. Another thing that's really important in this work is to keep adapting and innovating your model. So one of the oldest advocacy groups in America is the Sierra Club, founded in 1892. And what they found is by the 1960s, their tactics were coming up short. In particular, they found that developers were really moving in and taking advantage of the protected wildlife areas, including the Walt Disney Company, which was trying to build a ski resort in the Sierra, in the Mineral King Valley of the Sierra Nevada mountains. And so they figured out that their traditional advocacy wasn't working. And so they created a legal defense fund to fight that work. And over many years, were able to stop that development and then turn legal defense into the new tactic they were using to advance their issues. It's also crucial, we talk a lot about organizing people. It's also crucial to organize information. And what we found is when you look at the work that's being done and you trace it backwards, it's often the people who are organizing academic information and research information and bringing that together that can make a big breakthrough. So an example, for example, is the work of the Environmental Defense Fund, which used the economic ideas of cap and trade to come up with a breakthrough to stop acid rain in the United States. And they were able to show that you could dramatically reduce acid rain while allowing companies to do it much more efficiently and much less costly than would have been done. And that wouldn't have happened if they hadn't taken the time to work with academics to figure out how to adapt those ideas into policy. And then the last one I wanted to sort of highlight is we call build a frame that lasts. So there was a lot of research done in the 1980s that showed the words you use really matter in how people make decisions. So a classic study showed, for example, that when you're giving people a choice of radiation therapy over surgery to fight cancer, if you frame it in terms of the probability of living rather than the probability of dying, they select radiation therapy 44% of the time instead of 18% of the time. So even when you're talking about life and death issues, the words we choose really matter. And the sociologist Irving Goffman called that framing. It's what you put inside the frame and outside the frame that really matters in terms of putting people's focus on the decisions they make. And sociologists that have looked at this in the context of the civil rights movement, like Christopher Parker, found that the frame of military service, particularly for veterans coming back from World War II, was particularly powerful in jumpstarting a new approach to civil rights that directly confronted the injustices in the world. And this idea of everyone serving, everyone being equal, coming back and experiencing these inequalities was really powerful in galvanizing people and jumpstarting that movement. So it's something really important as we think about our work is what are the stories we're telling, the words we're using, how are we connecting this back to other ideals as we try to make the advocacy efforts for change in the world. So I'll stop there, Liz, and hand it back to you.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Those are great. Okay, so now for Paula, Kelsey, and Susanna, I want to ask you to share one of the lessons. It can be one of the ones that Mark just highlighted, or I know you've had access to all of them, and everyone listening will have to just wait till July. But could you sort of share, one that just jumps out at you as it relates to your own work and kind of how it might either reflect the way you've already been thinking or perhaps change how you're thinking moving forward? And Paula, let's start with you.
Sure. So, I think the idea of sort of building a framework, building the brand of what it is that we're talking about and us being the folks to do that is super important. And I think we've seen that in New Jersey. Obviously there is kind of this silver bullet fatigue that we know exists in education, right? No one wants to hear like, this is the, next big thing that's going to make everything fine. But tutoring had, a little bit of that. It was easy to fall into that trap. And so I think that we really came out of the gate saying high dosage, high quality, and we never said tutoring unless we said high dosage, high quality, which still was about managing expectations, right? Like it has to be high dosage. It has to be high quality. So don't tell me, oh, you're doing tutoring, that sort of thing. Like that part is important. And sort of driving that home to manage expectations to say, yes, it does work, but here is what that looks like. So I think framing the language was really important for us at the beginning. But I'll also say that I think there's that piece about begin with betrayal. And for us, it wasn't so much begin with betrayal as as in drive home the betrayal that came halfway through the process. So what happened was here in the state of New Jersey, JerseyCAN was responsible for getting the first $1 million in the state budget for tutoring, and that was great. And, there was a lot of buzz around tutoring. We got $10 million after that. And then the state said, the governor said, hey, we're going to create this RFP and, we're going to get millions of dollars out to districts for high dosage tutoring. And then they botched it. They created this really cumbersome process that did not need to exist around, like putting things out to bid and all of this kind of stuff. So they were 3 months behind on getting tutoring dollars out the door to districts for the tutoring outfits that they had selected. And so our conversation around that has been like, are you kidding me? Like, we have these dollars sitting here and we've been betrayed by our government because of bureaucratic nonsense, right? That's like holding up money that kids need. And we know that time is of the essence. We know that we lost learning, like, come on. And so that has really resonated on the ground around like, let's make sure that we get these dollars because this is absolutely unconscionable. This should not be the thing that's stopping students from getting, addressing the loss of the, of learning or in fact, accelerating their loss. Accelerating their learning, independent of loss.
One quick follow-up before we go on the next person, like on the language piece, Paula, like, did you guys have explicit conversations of like, okay, we always want to use that language? Was there any resistance to that? Or was it something you found yourself doing and realized it was working?
Yeah, so it was really about driving that home. I think that there was one, like the main or a nonprofit that is doing tutoring here in the state of New Jersey. They've always been really consistent and we have synced up on that. But then since then, there have been other, nonprofits that, that have thrown their hat in the ring and so on. And we've been careful to have those conversations with them. We haven't been able to have those conversations with every tutoring organization, but we are very consistent with that language. And certainly in testimony or slips of support and all of those kinds of things, we've been super consistent about that.
Yeah. Well, okay, I'm going to choose Susanna next, even though you may not be talking about this at all, but I do know that I know you guys have also thought a lot about the language piece. And so I'm curious if that was also where you were going to go with yours, or what are you going to say to us?
That's right. I'm going to get to the language piece. Actually, I also agree with Paula on the importance of beginning with betrayal. So it's like, how is it possible that students from high income families have had access to this kind of key educational resource for so many years, while other students, many of whom could benefit more, haven't had that? So I think that's, that's been a really important kind of message to engage people. That said, on the more boring side, not surprisingly, NSSA, the National Student Support Accelerator, is part of Stanford. And so the role of being an information organizer, the number 24 in this list, really spoke to me. So I think what separates NSSA maybe from other organizations in tutoring is kind of our direct link between research and the kind of engagement and strategic advising that we do. It's a natural place for us to be because we do a lot of the research, but you would think that if you do a lot of the research, you would also organize it, but we hadn't really spent the kind of intense time needed to organize it. And that's been really useful. So you take these bits of information and you put it into kind of knowledge that people can actually use to make decisions for the people who get to make decisions that actually affect students. And I think that's where this other element that you were talking about comes in, which is building our brand. And our brand, I think, really has been this link between research and practice, and how we organize it. And if you look at, and then Paula was saying this too, we saw that there were just many, many different ways people define tutoring. And it was important for us to take the research, figure out exactly what it takes, what are the most promising practices, you know, more than 3 days per week with a consistent tutor so you can build a relationship in school, informed by data, and having good instructional materials. All of these things, if you pulled them together, led to kind of really effective tutoring, while some of the kind of one-off tutoring didn't. And so building this shared language was really key, I think, and getting that language out, and in some ways making that language be our brand. So all of the materials and engagement that we do uses that same language that we and other people together have come up with and kind of put into hopefully an easy way for people who are making decisions to be able to talk to each other. And so even though we aren't kind of fully there right now, I think there's still some places, particularly on the coast that I'm on, the West Coast, where we still need to do more to kind of continue to build that shared language. But I think that's been key to any effect that we've had. And it's kind of, even though it's a little different than a brand, it really has been fundamental to kind of our brand and the effect that I think we've been able to have.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And my follow-up for you is, as you're thinking about doing that information organizing piece, like how hard is it to think about, are you trying to organize information differently for different audiences? Like this is something that both I could see that you might be thinking about researchers and policymakers and advocates. An advocacy group might be thinking about, well, I want to reach sort of my constituents, but also decision makers. Like how do you think about how to organize that information for different groups?
Yeah, so I think it's kind of a two-step process, I think. I mean, fundamentally underneath it, we want to agree on what the knowledge is that's out there. What do we really know, both from research and from just experiences in the field? How can we bring people together and kind of agree on what is the most promising practice? Then kind of the types of engagement and materials that we produce out of that, of course, are going to be really different for different stakeholders and for different people involved. And so, you know, state policymakers need example policies that they can have, while folks in the district need kind of maybe more detail about what they can do, what kinds of committees are useful in schools, what kind of additional personnel are useful, where can they source tutors from. They just need a lot kind of more detailed information in some ways. And then parents, teachers unions, a whole group of people who can really advocate. And that advocacy, I think we've seen, is super important on the ground. They need some other kinds of materials that people who have super busy lives but just want to engage in this in the time that they have can leverage. So yes, definitely different materials, but underneath it all, I think it's based on the same kind of organizing of the knowledge that we have.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. All right, Chelsea, you've waited patiently, and now we are so excited to hear about what this all looks like in Tennessee.
Yes, I'm so excited to talk about that. And I think I am sitting here listening to Paula, listening to Susanna, drinking the Kool-Aid. I hope we all are. Tutoring is a really big, impactful thing. I think we've seen that play out in the first few years of data in Tennessee. When we were talking through those lessons and the AdvocacyLabs guidebook that's going to be coming out, the one that stuck out to me the most was Be Bold. I think Tennessee certainly did take a very bold approach when we were thinking about tutoring. We were really making sure early, kind of in the throes of the pandemic, that we were paying attention to the needs our students had, and that we were being really thoughtful to put in place research-backed strategies that were going to help recover any learning loss, but then accelerate learning far beyond that. And I think, you know, when you think about getting that done in the midst of the pandemic, it's really hard. And we had conversations internal at the department at the time where we were negotiating with ourselves, and we kind of had to be accountability buddies and say, actually, is there a reason why we are diluting? Is there a reason why we can't go bigger? And luckily, we landed on a place where I feel like very proud. We went big, we did not go home. So what we have now is one of the largest tutoring programs in the country. We've got folks who are putting incredible points on the board for kids when we talk about outcomes. But we really wanted to make sure that we had everybody on the same page about what the requirements were. We talk about research-based strategies. If we're going to go big or go home, we've all got to be on the same page and making sure that we're executing tutoring in the way that the research showed did work. And so what that looked like was, high dosage, low ratio. That's the language that we've been using in this webinar. That's language that we used in the code when we put this policy and program into state law. That is the language that we used in grant making and implementation and toolkits and providing communication to the various stakeholders, kind of as Susanna was mentioning. We used high dosage, low ratio quite a bit. And in fact, I think the second lesson that I might mention here is about the brand and kind of using that common language. I think we've all touched on that. Tennessee All Core means something in Tennessee, and it means 2 to 3 times a week, 30 to 45-minute sessions, focusing on a singular subject for the entirety of a semester. And so when you go big and you really have a common nomenclature, a brand that folks understand what it means, and you were then able to show the benefit of these programs. I think that's really the secret sauce that I've been very proud of. Before we kind of go on to the next thing, I do want to just share a couple of those outcomes, because in Tennessee, we came back into a very special, extraordinary legislative session in January 2021, where we passed our tutoring policy into state law. And so it began immediately. We've got about 3 years of academic data now. And when you think about some of those littlest learners, that's some of the outcomes I want to share. So last year in our assessments, we were thinking about third graders. We saw historic gains of students who were proficient in ELA in many terms and in many cases as a result of the tutoring supports that they had. Those third graders last year went on to 4th grade this year. And guess what? We also had historic gains this year in that same cohort of students who are benefiting from these ongoing supports. And so the proof is in the pudding. Now we've got to keep our foot on the gas pedal. We've got to talk about these outcomes and talk about the benefits to students, but really making sure that we're going to continue to be bold is where I want to put our effort, and making sure that we're going to stay true to that Tennessee All Core brand when we know we're using the high dosage, low ratio model.
I love that. I mean, I was thinking as you're talking about be bold, which I want us to be bold on tutoring. And this totally wasn't in any of the questions I told you I might ask, but I will say that if any of you wants to throw out today a goal for what should be our, be bold goal on tutoring, I've been trying to think about do we want to say it's certain grade levels, certain percentage of students? Is it every first grader? There's a lot of ways we could think about it, but I do wonder if there's sort of a moment to kind of coalesce on some of this. Okay, that's one thing I'll throw out there. But that also, I think, and Mark, feel free to jump in because I'm probably going to butcher the lesson on this. But I also wonder if there is this vigilance that's required when we set the bold goal and it gets implemented, because I worry that sometimes what we see happening is that a state or a district or even a school will say we're doing tutoring and we're doing it in this way, but then the reality of implementation doesn't meet the boldness of the goal that they've even set out to do. And so there's just this gap between sort of the bold goal and reality that I think we need to also be paying attention to. And Chelsea, I wonder, from in Tennessee, how do you guys think about how to ensure that the full boldness of that goal continues to be what's actually happening for kids?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And I will say, I think immediately when we put that policy into place, one of the big motivators to ensure everybody was doing it, quote unquote, the right way was grant dollars, in fact. So if you think about in Tennessee, our state code calls out Tennessee All Core as our tutoring approach. We had Tennessee All Core grants that were associated with that. We used some of that federal COVID funding to incentivize districts to take up this very particular type of tutoring. We would give you $200 million to do it across the state. And so that really, really helped ensure that districts and some of the community partners who we engaged in Tennessee to do this work were all kind of ensuring that same approach and the same level of preparation for the folks who were tutoring. In many cases, we saw teachers who were coming into a tutoring space. Sometimes it was, the community volunteers the grandmas and the grandpas and the neighbor down the street who really picked up kind of the training materials and were able to implement that with great fidelity. The other thing I will say, and it kind of gets to the point of tenacity, it's really important to continue to talk about the value of programs like this. When we talk about making available tutoring to 200,000 students, that level of access feels like a big win, but it's super important, I think, to talk about the end result, kind of the investment and the return on the investment that you've made through the policies that can be very hard to implement. They can be expensive, they can be time consuming, especially when they're new, they can be scary. So there are two partners I want to talk about in Tennessee in particular, just to give you a sense of the possible, because it's incredible. You hear about these numbers and I can't believe that this has happened. One is a district. It's in Trousdale County, in a middle Tennessee space, more rural community, but close enough to a city center that you might call it a suburb. Maybe one of these days, if Nashville continues to boom, it will be considered a kind of suburban district. But they really focus tutoring on 3rd and 5th graders. They had lots of different options on how to prioritize students for the services that were provided. But those 3rd and 5th grade students, that kind of cohort who started just a couple of years ago, 44% of those students moved into proficiency. So that's almost half of the kids who benefited from tutoring were able to kind of clear the hurdle where they were meeting or exceeding expectations, which is incredible. If you go a little bit, with a younger cohort of students, the Nicewanger Foundation is a community partner that I will mention in the eastern part of our state, really kind of came up with an incredible program, marketed it to families. They really focused on 1st grade as part of their program. They had 8% of 1st graders, kind of when they started their tutoring program, who were considered to be on track for their age, in their learning. At the end of their tutoring cohort, 59% were considered to be on track. And so you're seeing incredible gains. That's a difference in a kid's life. And that goes so much further when you're storytelling than access to 200,000 seats in tutoring. Like, you're talking about really clear impacts in the lives of children. So I really want to encourage us to think about that as we're either starting a program or trying to expand, protect, defend a program. Let's tell stories in ways that are really human focused.
That's great. And I feel like I could listen to you tell stories about Tennessee all day. But so I want to do, so we have like 18 minutes or so left. We have a couple questions coming in. Keep them coming. We'll get to them in just a minute. But I want to kind of pivot us a little bit from the work that you all have been doing to the work you're going to be doing. Because as we laid out at the beginning, like, this is a precarious moment for this thing that is happening in so many places with so much success. So as each of you thinks ahead to the work that your organization will be doing with regard to tutoring in the next, year or so, like, what, first of all, like, kind of what's keeping you up at night, and like, of these lessons of advocacy, like, what are the ones that you're hoping will sort of be a guide for you?
Yeah. So I'm just going to complicate things by throwing another idea into the mix from our wonderful advocacy guidebook. And that is this notion of earthquake proofing your campaign. Because we need a lot of help in that area in the state of New Jersey. So we have a couple of challenges. One is that on the portal that shows up, online, where you can see folks spending their money, it does not appear in many instances that people are spending their tutoring money. That does not make it easy for an advocate to advocate for, high dosage, high quality tutoring when it's like, oh, well, you're all not even spending the money that you do have, right? So it's this idea of communicating to the field that, if we want this to continue to happen, then you have to be, you can't have people that are just lazy or errant, quite frankly, that's sitting in the accounting office. They've got to put this money up so it shows that the funds are encumbered, that they're actually spending it, and not just showing, but that they actually have to be spending the money and using it for tutoring. The other piece is around, I think, so for, making sure that our providers are not putting all their eggs in one sort of tutoring basket, if you will. So, we worked really hard to get money in the state budget, but as you know, every year you got to get money in the state budget, right? Like, and so, you know, we can't have a business model where we have, you know, tutoring providers depending solely on this funding in order for that to happen. They have to be able to communicate their value proposition to, you know, to the districts that they serve by having outcomes like what Chelsea mentioned. You know, we're seeing, you know, in specific districts in the state of Tennessee, and also with one of our tutoring providers, New Jersey Tutoring Corps, they actually applied for and got a designation through the U.S. Department of Labor to approve them as a registered apprenticeship pathway. So now they're going to be getting apprenticeship dollars for the tutors, you know, that are, you know, that are doing the tutoring. They've got to be able to diversify their income, you know, base, while we're also advocating in real time for, you know, sort of more permanent embedded funding, because otherwise, you know, it's just too precarious.
Susanna, what about you? What do you guys think about, you know, as ESSER funds wind down, you know, what are you thinking is going to be the big hurdle for the work that you're trying to do?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, of course, with the pandemic and the ESSER funds, it was kind of easy to make an argument in some ways that there had been this betrayal due to the pandemic, and there was all this kind of all these students who really deserved this intervention, and let's get that in there, use these kinds of funds. But I think what we've learned during this time is it's not a student who suddenly had a shock that can benefit from it. And it's not something that should be an outside part of what we do in schools if we've made a mistake. It really can be such a kind of a fundamental part of our core instructional approach. And if we think, you know, many students are going to go along and they're going to hit a place where they could use a little bit of individualized instruction to help them get back in, and having that be relationship based so that it's motivating and engaging is the way that it works. And so we just need to kind of shift from, here has been a shock that we need to address with the method that we need to address, to one, couldn't our whole education system be more equitable and more effective if we had this kind of individualized instruction built into it? And I think that's kind of a change in perspective, and getting that change in perspective in there is tricky. And so I think it's a question of kind of persisting and just keep going on in this. It's a question of mobilizing the grassroots, which is one of the elements that Marc identifies. I think it's going to take parents saying, this is what my students, what my children should have access to in school. This is what our community should give our students access to. So I think we're going to need a lot of push there. And as Paula mentioned, it's the kind of downside of tutoring in some ways is that it's not that easy to implement well. So if you implement it well, it's the best thing we know for accelerating students' learning, but you have to implement it well, and it's hard to do. So people might not be taking it up because it takes that extra effort to take it up. And so because of that, I think this kind of persisting, mobilizing people to know that it's worth it to make the effort to put it in, and then really innovating and getting the information out on what's working through stories as well. I think, Chelsea, your stories are just so important for this next round to show that this is something that can truly impact you know, a really broad group of students and make our education, our schools better for students, for their flourishing overall. So that's kind of where we are. How can we make that transition from something meant to address the pandemic to something long-term and embedded? And how can we bring together a whole group of advocates that really can believe in this and help this move forward?
Chelsea, I'm going to kind of combine an audience question with a question I've been wanting to ask, which is around sort of like who and how is most receptive to advocacy. But I'm really curious, from when you were in the Tennessee Department of Education, like obviously I'm sure, especially during COVID, there's all sorts of people saying, do this, do that, do this, right? Like what's your impression of like what makes for who effective advocacy, like hearing your voice kind of heard. The question from the audience was, tutoring programs can flourish because of active principals, thoughtful superintendents, state executives, etc. Which of those do you think have been or can be most receptive to your advocacy? So kind of a question of like, is there a type of person or organization, or is it in the how they and what they kind of bring to the, you know, the thing they're advocating for?
It's a really interesting question. I'm glad you kind of merged them. I'm going to try and tie together a couple of things, because I think what Paula and Susanna mentioned about the things that keep me up at night or keep them up at night are similar to what keeps me up at night. If we dilute the quality of what we were doing, we do not have the outcomes to show that we could have had, that we already have had. And therefore, we have a little bit less advantage when it comes to advocating for continuation of the resources or expansion of the resources. I think a couple of folks have mentioned tutoring is really hard to implement. It can be scary. It can take a pretty big paradigm shift in terms of thinking. In Tennessee, luckily, we were a little bit forged by fire in our entree into a very expansive tutoring program, because it happened literally smack dab in the pandemic. In January 2021, we saw lots of districts across the country who were still conducting virtual learning. In Tennessee, we had been back in class for the most part for the entirety of that year, and we're really trying to be out, think outside of the box to make sure that we were putting additional learning time at the fore, that we could really meet students where they were and kind of help them either catch up or accelerate beyond. When it comes to advocacy, I think the state officials component, obviously that's where I was sitting during this time frame. We had great belief in this research-based program and this research-based approach. We had great belief in our ability to work with other elected officials who were highly, highly stressed and distracted by a million problems across our society in the midst of the pandemic. Negotiating with the governor, negotiating with leadership in the General Assembly, and then, of course, the entire body when you're trying to pass legislation. Those folks were worried about all kinds of issues when it came to health and safety, availability of resources. What are we going to do with these billions of dollars in federal funding that have fallen into our laps? We really, I think, create a united front by working across leadership in the department, with the governor's office, with some of the leaders in the General Assembly, to turn our attention and focus for a singular amount of time towards our children and our next generations. And so that was really important. The other thing I will say, never would this have happened if it had not been for superintendents and principals and teachers and tutors. The folks who actually bought into this, superintendents, they also had a whole lot of challenge on their hands. When you think about, the 2021 timeframe, it was crazy. I mean, if we had taken everything in education in our bucket, pumped it upside down, scrambled it around on the table. And so we had to do a lot of work with our superintendents to talk to them about the possibility of something like this coming online for their students. Luckily, those educators lead with an educator's heart, and we're really able to, find the grit to bring their teams along. We were able to develop toolkits and supports to help it make it easier for them to implement this with fidelity in a way that would be impactful. But they had the belief and they had the want to as well. I'll kind of close with another thing that keeps me up at night. It's really, the disbelief or the fatigue that may come. You see a lot of turnover in some of our leadership positions in districts and schools across the state. Some of the folks who are leading our schools and districts now were not there during the pandemic. And some of the folks who were there in the pandemic are very happy to no longer be in those leadership positions, because it's a hard job. And I think as we move forward in the next few years in Tennessee, I would like to see us maintain a concerted effort to bring in our leadership across state government, within our administrative department, state board of education, and then of course the administrators at the school and district level, to help ensure that they themselves know the results, they know the investment that they're getting on these programs, that they can tell those stories back to influencers in their communities, their elected officials, their county commissions, city councils, and of course, and very importantly, teachers and parents. So hopefully I tied that up in a nice bow, but I appreciate the opportunity to talk to a few different questions here, Liz. Thanks.
Okay, so I'm going to ask a question that was actually only asked of one person, but I'm going to ask it to all of you because I kind of want to get everyone's take on it. I'm even going to make Mark answer. I think this will maybe be like our last question we'll take. But so, and I'm laughing because while Paula was telling the story about the betrayal in New Jersey of this program that didn't roll out well and the challenges with it, I thought to myself, this is not the only state I've heard of that has this challenge. I know in New Mexico, they have had a few different issues. They had a contract with an on-demand tutoring company that they then canceled. They then announced a big state program with a disastrous rollout of an RFP that they pulled back and then kind of did one with the short. Anyways, New Mexico, a state with some challenges. So for each of you, all four of you, lightning round answers here. Like, what would your advice be for advocates in a state that has either screwed up the rollout of a tutoring program with remaining funds or is struggling, just generally to, like, maybe because it's still New Jersey and there's still challenges, right? What would your advice be to the advocates, like, to, what do they do? What should they do next?
Several thoughts, but it's a lightning round. Find a win and hype the heck out of it. Like, is there someone, some school, some district that did implement tutoring and did see an impact? So that way you can say, see, like, this is what we could have been doing with X number, how many thousands more kids, how many hundreds more kids, but no, y'all had to go and botch, right? So making sure that that example exists of what's possible. And I think it's super important to be homegrown. It's got to be a New Mexican example because, folks play the dozens in education. If you don't know what that means, look it up. But it's like, my district is worse than my state is worse than your state. So we need an example that's local, hyper local, in order to say that this was possible.
Okay, who's next?
I would underline what Paula said. I think it is very easy to fall into despair in education. So I think on some level, we want to uplift problems, put a spotlight on them, get people outraged. We have to be very careful that it's only a scandal if there's a solution. It's not a scandal if that's just the way the world works. Nothing ever gets implemented properly. So I think we've got to show that. And then I think insist on that action, and which requires, I think, just being relentless, like waking up every day and talking about tutoring.
Yeah, I will second that and also say that I think the focus has to be on getting students access to this resource, to the individualized instruction that's from a tutor that knows them and cares about them so they can motivate them. And so maybe this approach didn't work here, but let's try a different one. It's about kind of, this is good education. This has to just be part of how we think about improving education. And it is possible that we try something like a contract with an opt-in provider because we thought that would provide it and it didn't. Okay, that didn't work, but it's not the underlying approach that doesn't work. And so this kind of persistence, I think, is really important to go along with the storytelling.
Ditto, retweet all of those things. I absolutely agree with everything that's been said. The other thing I would say is to make this human. Get them in a school, get them in front of a child, show them a piece of homework or an essay or something that was actually turned in by a student. It becomes much more actionable when it becomes human. And sometimes you got to talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly, because frankly, all of our kids deserve great, but all of our kids are not getting great. And so it takes a little bit of educating to illuminate what is happening, what is possible, that we can get there, and imagine what would happen if we didn't. So I would say humanize it at every opportunity.
And okay, well, I wasn't going to ask my own advice, but I'll just say this. Like, I think, like, another way to think about the Be Bold goal, which I'm really going to, by the way, Mark, I'm going to talk to you. I think we need to do a thing and get everyone to tell us their bold goals on tutoring. So guys have big bold goals on tutoring. We should all be considering Liz.Cohen at Georgetown.edu. Send them my way. We'll figure out something cool to do with them. But I think you could also be bold in your advocacy goals. Like, maybe your goal is, like, every state legislator in New Mexico should see what tutoring looks like in person over the next 6 months. Like, how, like, can you get because it is really different when you go and you see what this actually is like and how it works and flows in what's happening. It's not what I think people still don't necessarily understand what it is, right? Even within our own world, some people say high dosage, some people say high impact, some people mean this, some people mean that. We're still working to define those terms, right, within those of us who are bought in. And I think as those circles get wider, we have to just remember how much people don't even know about what this looks like. So I also think just, like, get more people out to schools to see what these successful programs what they actually look like and the difference that they're making. And I think that helps, hopefully, people want to recreate that. But Marc, I want to let you kind of close us out. Like, what's your favorite lesson nobody talked about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, I think this idea, we got at it a little bit with persistence, but this idea of just being relentless, I think is so important to this work. And I think when you trace these advocates that are really effective, they're just willing to go a little bit further than everyone else in fighting for their goal. So if we really want this to happen, if we really believe in tutoring, and we know, I think you're right, Liz, it's under potential threat now, then we can't afford to waste the next year letting people roll these programs back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for joining us again. Sign up for the 50CAN newsletter, Future Ed newsletter. That way you will find out how to try to get your own free copy of the AdvocacyLabs guidebook. Thank you to Paula, Chelsea, and Susanna for joining us and sharing all of your expertise from out in the field, and everyone else. Have a wonderful June afternoon.
Bye, everyone.